Remember that the term habitat patch refers to a defined area of a particular habitat type. Different species require different habitat patch types and patch sizes. The species that will use a given patch is determined by the size and the shape of the patch, as well as the type of vegetation that is present within the patch. As I mentioned earlier, these patches change over time. They're dynamic. Nothing in the natural world stays the same. And so the dynamics of these patches are influenced by two things that you guys are really familiar with by now. The first influencing factor is the natural disturbance regime of the ecosystem in question. The second influencing factor is the nature of human disturbance, or lack of human disturbance within that ecosystem. You can think of the landscape as a mosaic of habitat patches resembling like a patchwork quilt of land use. All of our individual management decisions at the property level or at the stand level contribute to these landscape level patterns. Wildlife habitat is best assessed at the landscape level. Again, wildlife species do not recognize property boundaries, so we always have to assess or manage based on how well what we hope to do contributes to landscape scale biodiversity and the presence of needed habitat. If you can think back to our forest ecosystems lecture, thinking back to the concept of forest succession, it is a really important concept here as it applies to wildlife habitat. Again, different species rely on different stages of succession. So again, we can think of forest succession as the transition from one vegetative community to another over time. As succession progresses from young forest to old forest, there are changes in both vegetative species composition and changes in stand structure. Early successional habitat, or patches of young forest, this successional habitat is perpetuated on the landscape by large-scale natural disturbances, which could include things like stand-replacing fires, hurricanes, really extensive ice storm damage, but it also may be perpetuated by human disturbance. Clear-cut harvesting, by definition, results in patches of young forest. Late successional habitat, or patches of old forest, develops in the absence of these stand-replacing events. Natural disturbance still occurs. It's just that the effect of that disturbance is less extensive. We're now going to look at several wildlife species that really exemplify this concept. A handful of species that rely fundamentally on different stages of succession. We're also going to look at how forest management may contribute in a positive way to the creation of these habitat components. The first example here, the Kirtland's warbler, is an endangered migratory songbird that breeds in the jack pine forests of Michigan. Jack pine is a fire-dependent species. It forms these single species stands and relies on stand-replacing fire events to regenerate. Hot fires that remove an entire stand at a time. It forms single species stands. Again, once that stand replacing event occurs. So these fire events occurred historically as part of the natural disturbance regime of that area. But now these large-scale fire events are suppressed. They're suppressed to really protect the lives and property of the people who live throughout the ecosystem now. The problem is the Kirtland's warbler relies on the large blocks of young forest that develop following these fire events, primarily for nesting habitat. And their population numbers have dwindled with the alteration of this disturbance regime due to fire suppression. As a means of supporting this species, forest managers are really just essentially simulating the effects of stand replacing fire by clear cutting in patches of at least 125 acres. And that's a no-joke size clear cut. I mean, it's a pretty extensive area, but they're implementing this type of management expressly for the purpose of supporting this endangered bird species. they've decided that that is the minimum size required by the warbler to use it effectively as habitat. So they harvest in these relatively large clear-cut areas, and then they plant young stands of jack pine following the harvest. So this species, this wildlife species is a really good example of one whose habitat needs would not be supported by a hands-off approach or a preservationist approach to management, simply because we've altered the natural disturbance regime through fire suppression, and there needs to be some other action to support the needs of this species. A little closer to home is the golden winged warbler, another migratory songbird reliant on early successional habitat for nesting and foraging. The southern portion of this species' North American habitat stretches into the southern Appalachians. Here it utilizes brushy habitat that's characteristic of young forest or abandoned agricultural land at relatively high elevations, elevations above 3,000 feet. In North Carolina, it's a species of concern, really because its range in the southern Appalachians has gotten smaller. The availability of quality early successional habitat in the southern Appalachians has decreased over the last several decades for a few different reasons. The reductions associated generally with a change in harvesting intensity, particularly on U.S. Forest Service land, where they used to harvest primarily through clear-cut harvesting. That no longer occurs to such an extent. There's also been a reduction in the amount of farmland on the landscape, and there's also been kind of a change from what was once young forest to middle-aged forest over the last several decades. And so these are the things that are kind of reducing the amount of early successional habitat that once existed a couple decades ago. The disturbance regime in the southern Appalachians generally precludes the establishment of large areas of early successional habitat. Typically, we don't have really large-scale disturbances that are stand-replacing disturbances. But this is another species whose habitat could be enhanced by an increase in purposeful management, particularly the use of even-age timber harvesting techniques. On the other end of the spectrum is this little critter here, the northern spotted owl, an endangered non-migratory resident of old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, is reliant on late successional forest. The northern spotted owl preys primarily on the dusky-footed woodrat in a late succession or old-growth forest setting. The forests of the Pacific Northwest contain large dead and downed trees on the forest floor that support the habitat needs of this woodrat. Also, older forests generally have fewer trees, even though they're larger, leading to more open conditions within the stand and facilitating the predation efforts of the northern spotted owl. This one wildlife species has had a profound impact on the timber harvesting that's occurred in the Pacific Northwest region. Where a region where intensive short rotation harvesting systems have been the norm for several decades. These management systems, this way of harvesting, is really efficient at producing Douglas fir saw timber, which is a lot of what land managers hope to do on this, on that forest land. But the management regime didn't really support the needs of this wildlife species. Following the listing of this species as endangered, the amount of harvesting that was conducted on U.S. Forest Service land was reduced dramatically. This, in addition to several other economic factors, has led to a decline in the number of jobs related to logging and milling in a region highly dependent on a thriving forest products industry. The debate regarding how to balance the needs of the owl and the needs of the people within these communities continues today, and as you can imagine, it's often really contentious. Researchers and foresters have already developed harvesting systems that balance both the ecological needs of the owl with the harvesting of timber products. In essence, managing towards these late successional characteristics needed by the owl in the setting of a working forest where harvesting can occur. It's all about altering the type of silviculture that is used to produce the desired products. The red cockaded woodpecker is another example of a wildlife species that relies on forest land that maintains late successional characteristics. The red cockaded woodpecker is a native of the longleaf pine forest ecosystems of the southeastern U.S., and it relies on old, hollow trees of sufficient size for nesting and food. It was placed on the endangered species list in the 1970s. We've already discussed longleaf pine in the context of fire behavior and management. The loss of longleaf pine dominated ecosystems are really a result of fire suppression, and the replacement of these forests with loblolly pine and slash pine plantations, species that lend themselves better to short rotation plantation style. This slide here shows an example of a relatively mature longleaf pine forest that's developed in the presence of, I guess, what you could consider the natural fire regime. What you have is kind of an open park-like structure with longleaf pine dominating the canopy, but with a really diverse group of species in the understory. What you have is an abundance of fire-adapted herbaceous species. Within the stand, there are standing dead trees, relatively large canopy trees that are now dead and hollow. This is characteristic of late successional longleaf pine forest. This slide provides an image of what has replaced the longleaf pine forest in many instances. Dense, young to mid-age loblolly pine plantations with far less biodiversity, particularly in the understory. Management for the red cockaded woodpecker should really aim to establish and maintain the conditions just described a couple slides ago. The minimum rotation age for managed stands, the recommended minimum rotation age for managed stands is 100 years. All harvesting systems, whether they're even-aged or uneven-aged, should establish permanent no-cut patches of at least 10 acres in size to support the development of large standing dead trees. And harvesting should not occur during the nesting season. Thinning treatments can be regularly implemented to maintain stands with that park-like appearance, right? With a relatively open appearance. And also, extremely important, the use of prescribed fire is needed to promote the development of those fire-adapted herbaceous species, and also to aid in the regeneration of longleaf pine seedlings that are dependent on wildfire to become established.